military machine, and the White House was evacuated amid further terrorist threats. At about 3:05, the events took a dramatic turn when the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed following the plane crashing into it, and by 3:15, Prime Minister Tony Blair had described the attacks in the United States as the most terrible, shocking event. By 3:25, a car bomb had exploded outside the State Department in Washington, and by 3:30, the North Tower of the World Trade Center had also collapsed, virtually destroying that bastion of Americanism. Finally, around 3:30, reports are emerging of a plane crash near Somerset County Airport near Pittsburgh. Now, just to recap the latest, we do still believe that there are a number of planes that are unaccounted for, and there could have been around 20,000 people inside the World Trade Center when it was hit. Also, the loss of life has been described as tremendous. And finally, the Foreign Office has warned British citizens overseas to take extra care, and that emergency number for anyone worried about relatives in America is 0207 008 0000. That emergency number is 0207 008 0000. That's the latest from the Sky News Centre. We'll bring you more updates as they come in.
Thank you, Martin. Bringing you Talksport, bringing you details of today's tragic events, and of course, nothing can replace the lives that have been lost during this afternoon or the morning out in America. But of course, the implications are widespread. We know financial institutions in the United Kingdom closed down, of course, in the city of London. And I would assume as well in other parts of the world. I mean, it's difficult to talk about money and things like this at a time like this, Mike, but of course there is a financial implication, isn't there?
I think we justify talking about what the financial situation is going to be by making it clear that the lives of everybody in the world will be affected by this tragedy. Not this tragedy, this barbaric attack, this inhumane assault on the United States of America. The lives of everybody in the world will be affected by it one way or another. You have to remember that the attack, the most devastating part of the attack, was at the heart of the world's top financial centre. Now, clearly, the confidence of the world in the ability for business to be done, and business is what keeps the economies moving around the world, and if the economies are moving, it means people are living in a more civilised world, and everybody benefits from a healthy economy worldwide. The economy suddenly slows down or plummets as it has done today, that's problems for us all. I mean, take for instance in London, the knock-on effect, because the London stock market of course was open, was a plunge of 219.6 points. That's down at 4,814, way below that psychological 5,000 point barrier which the city's been trying to avoid for the last 2 weeks, because of course there is a slowdown in the economy anyway.
And then of course people, they've shut that down.
Oh, shut down.
Anyway, so...
Shut down. All the European markets have plunged. The New York Stock Exchange was evacuated, of course, today. Trading was cancelled. That won't start again today. World Trade Center, the World Financial Center, before they collapsed, they attempted to evacuate all the buildings that were buildings contracted to the people who worked in those buildings. The London market started up this morning. There was some sign of a revival, a mini revival, because it's been a poor 10 days on the markets, and it's 70 points up. It plunged down. Nobody can possibly estimate what's going to happen to the markets tomorrow. I mean, I don't know when trading's going to start again in New York. Trading in London can keep going, but I mean, in New York, I'm not sure how. I mean, let's get this absolutely straight. The World Trade Center was not the U.S. Stock Exchange. U.S. Stock Exchange is a separate building, but it's only a few streets away from the World Trade Center. So when you can start trading again on the U.S. Stock Exchange, I have absolutely no idea. Just think of the value of the buildings alone. Think of the value of the business that is transacted every day in those markets which are housed in the World Trade Center. 50 floors alone, we've heard, haven't we? 50 floors alone of one of the international merchant banks housed inside the World Trade Center.
Yep.
And I mean, when you're talking about that sort of business, that volume of business not happening, then quite honestly, it's impossible to say, just what is going to happen.
Well, Israel's withdrawn all its diplomats from the US, fearing there may be targets, because of course further targets. We've still got a plane missing as well. We talk about the value of things. Of course, Mike was making that point earlier. We can't put a value of hit course on the number of lives that have been lost this afternoon. Mike, is there some other news that you can...
Well, only that we're now trying to get a handle on how many flights have actually been involved, how many aircraft have been involved. We know about 4 aircraft that have been involved, one each that hit one of the 2 towers of the World Trade Center, which have subsequently collapsed. So we know there are 2 planes accounted for there. We know that a plane crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. That's the 3rd plane accounted for. We know that a 4th plane crashed 80 miles south of Pittsburgh. I think that was the Somerset County Airport crash.
That's right, yeah.
And then there's a 5th plane, which we're being told, I think, in bits and pieces, is still missing. And this is the plane that took off from Boston, heading for L.A., and nobody seems to know what has happened to that plane, but I think it's now officially...
Well, we might hear soon, because President Bush apparently is about to make another statement shortly, so we shall get the news. Just you know, because people were coming out of work, people won't know what's happening. I just want to try and get people to imagine. Just think of the skyline of New York City, you know, that you would see, you know, obviously the Twin Towers.
I've just heard as well, Rich, I'm sorry, from another source, that President Bush will not be returning to Washington today. President Bush has been out of the capital today. We're told he's not going to be returning to Washington. That must obviously be a security factor involving the safety of the president. We were hearing from Keith Graves, our old colleague, earlier
at Sky,
at Sky, that the president is on Air Force One. Air Force One, he said, is a self-contained White House. It certainly is. And one thing that we've never really noticed over the last few years, since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the easing of tension between the East and the West superpowers, because Russia now, of course, has broken up. But in the old days, we always used to talk about the man who trailed around behind the president, carrying the case with the nuclear codes in it. Well, that man's still around. He hasn't gone away. And this is one of the situations in which that guy is so absolutely vital to America's interests, because if this had been not a domestic attack, but an international attack involving a nuclear attack, which might sound incredulous to you, but if I'd have said to you this morning, a couple of hijacked aeroplanes are going to be taken and crashed into the World Trade Center, you'd have told me that was incredulous. There is no incredulity left anymore in what terrorists can do to attack the free world.
Anything's possible.
Anything is now possible. And so the man who's trailing around behind President Bush with the nuclear codes is now a very, very important part of America's defense strategy. He will be on board Air Force One with the president. I don't think we're going to be told where Air Force One's going to land tonight, because let's face it, the President of the United States of America is himself a target for these terrorists who have created devastation, terror and destruction right across the United States today.
Indeed, and I was saying, Mike, before that, I just wanted to get people to get some kind of image when 2 buildings, of course, are destroyed, collapsed. The rubble and the buildings that are collapsed underneath it meant that Manhattan, the heart, if you like, of New York City, particularly its financial heart, basically just disappeared. The whole skyscraper, the whole image of New York City disappeared, as we know, under a cloud of smoke, under a cloud of rubble.
Yep.
And it's only now just beginning to emerge again from that cloud and from that rubble as well. 10,000 people supposedly were
in each tower
at the time
of the attack.
We've reported, in case, you know, people are coming out all the time. We've seen pictures, harrowing pictures of people hanging out of the building with fire engulfing them, not knowing whether to jump to death or to be burnt to death.
Thousands of feet above the streets of Manhattan, thousands of feet above the financial district. Some politicians are comparing today to Pearl Harbor. I would say it's worse. I would say it's much worse. Pearl Harbor was contained at one American military base 3,000 miles away from the American mainland. This has hit at the heart of the American mainland, and we think thousands of innocent civilians have been involved in the death and destruction which has taken place this afternoon in America. We think there are thousands of civilian victims of the terror inflicted on the United States today. At least you can say Pearl Harbor was restricted, A, to the military, and B, to one location involving the American fleet. This, I'm afraid, has devastated the American heartland. The Twin Towers of America were the potent symbol of the financial might of the United States. That's now disappeared, and as you quite rightly say, the American skyline will never be the same again until they rebuild those towers, which I believe, knowing the American people as I do, they will want to do.
All aircraft have been grounded. The United States has sealed its land borders, of course. There are 2 land borders, one with Mexico and one with Russia as well. They've both been sealed. No one can get in. Nobody can get out. All flights, of course, to America have been cancelled, at least, we believe, I think, Mike, you were saying earlier, for 2 days. We're waiting to hear from President Bush, who, of course, earlier said he's vowing to find those who are responsible. Where he is, of course, we won't know for security reasons, but with United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to LA still reported missing, this is still an ongoing story, and one which hopefully I think we've brought enough bad news on Talksport already this afternoon. We don't need to bring any more.
Sorry, Rich, I'm told now, I've got to correct myself from what I told you earlier. I told you earlier that President Bush would not be returning to Washington. That looks like it was a smokescreen of information put out, because we're now told that President Bush will be returning to Washington and will be talking about the attacks very shortly from a location in Washington, D.C., although we don't know yet where that is.
You're listening to Talksport on a day where, just to remind you again, as if we need any reminding, one aeroplane crashed into the World Trade Center. It was a terrorist attack, a suicide attack on the World Trade Center. 18 minutes later, another one went in. Then the Pentagon was also attacked with another plane crashing into it. Another one crashed 80 miles south of Pittsburgh onto a freeway there as well. A car bomb as well at Capitol Hill has exploded. Another plane is missing that was believed to be on its way to Washington. The skies are being patrolled by the United States Air Force as well. The country of America is in complete shock as thousands of lives have been lost. Also, the reverberations have been felt across the world, with government buildings, financial institutions in this country and across Europe being evacuated as well. There's been an emergency number as well that, of course, people have been able to contact if they're worried about friends and relatives in and around America who may have been caught up in this devastating attack. The number for you to call, it's an emergency number. Please, of course, they're going to be bombarded with calls, so please do only call this number if you have any fears or of any relatives and friends who might have been there. The number for it is 0207 008 0000, 0207 008 0000. Let's now go to Dr. Alan George, who's a Middle East expert, and he joins us now on Talksport. He writes for The Economist. Good afternoon, Dr. Alan George.
Good afternoon.
You're a Middle East expert. Now, of course, the fears and the belief for this is that the reported terrorist attacks have come from the Middle East, in particular from Afghanistan.
Yes, but it has to be stressed at the moment this is pure speculation.
Indeed.
One can see certain possible candidates, but it's not much more than that at the moment.
When you say we can speculate, I mean, what would you speculate then, Alan? Would be capable of causing this?
I speculate that it's an Islamic fundamentalist group. I think the group headed by Osama bin Laden, which is indeed based in Afghanistan, and who were responsible for the blowing up of American embassies in East Africa recently, or some years back, are plainly a potential group. But there was, of course, a previous attempt to blow up the World Trade Center involving an Egyptian Islamist group. So one, I think at this stage, shouldn't rule out any particular group, but I would put my money on the Afghanistan-based group if I had to put it anywhere.
Alan, the size of this attack is incredulous. I mean, you can barely comprehend what's happened today.
Yep.
I mean, what sort of organisation can mount an attack like this on so many different fronts?
Well, if you actually stand back from it, it doesn't need enormous manpower. It needs dedicated small numbers of people. So I don't think one should be astonished at the scale of the devastation which has been wrought. Indeed, it's a terrifying illustration of what fanaticism can achieve. But I think it's also a mistake simply to say, oh my God, isn't this terrible? One has to analyze what gave rise to that fanaticism, which, of course, is a whole other story over many years. People don't just wake up one morning and decide they're going to hijack a plane and kill themselves and many others.
Alan, I'm sure you're right, but I just don't think now is the time to examine what led to this. The point is we're actually discussing the devastation that's been wreaked today. Can you tell me the mindset of somebody who is so determined to wreak terror upon the United States of America that giving his own life is an immaterial issue?
Yes, I take your point that we are, if you like, you don't wish to analyze the reasons, but I think one actually cannot ignore the reasons. It is, in fact, not good enough just to say, isn't it awful? And the mindset of somebody who